It's my pleasure to be here. It's a very unique audience for me to talk to, so I'm very excited. So I spent about the last 8 years looking at multitasking among information workers. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm pulling out some of the studies from this work, and then I'm going to end it with talking about a very recent study we did where we turned off email in an organization. But first, let me present what I think the problem is. The problem is that we're really caught between two eras. So right now, there's this widespread adoption of IT, and we just have this wonderful array of applications, devices, but we've not yet reached the point, and I'm very optimistic that hopefully in the near future, and you folks are going to make this happen, that we can get to the point where people can maintain a continuity in their flow of information use and interaction with people without being overloaded. And so, you know, we're squeezed in this era, and we need to break out. I'm going to present you a lot of data that I hope will convince you when I talk about multitasking and overload of information, and hopefully when I'm done, you'll be convinced. Another problem is that people, by and large, are monochronics. What that means is people like to work from one task through to completion before working on something else. I'm that way. The majority of people are that way. There are some people that thrive in multitasking, switching tasks back and forth, but by and large, most people are monochronic. The problem is we're living in a polychronic world. We have to react to the demands of the workplace, the demands of the environment. It's the information, it's the requests for interactions that lead us to be polychronics, which is task and people switching. So this is a dilemma for people. So I've done a number of studies, and let me just give you a quick overview of the methodology that we used. It's really important that I explain to you how we got our data so that when you see what the data is, it will make sense. So we've done what's called ethnographic observation, which is human observation of people. We are now using sensors to capture a lot of this behavior of people. It's a very wise move because it's very labor intensive to do human observation. What we did when we did the human observation is we would have observers go into the workplace, and they would use a stopwatch, and every time anyone did any action, picking up the phone, start time, put the phone down, stop time, switch to a Word doc, start time, switch to email, stop time for the Word doc, start time for the email. Sometimes the switching would be really fast. So it was very painstaking data collection. Each person would be observed for a period of 3.5 days because sometimes there might be a day that's not typical, so you want to take a broad average. We would have the observer spend a half day with the person just so that they could get used to having someone shadowing them. And the observers also spent a period of 10 days in the organization to learn about the context of the work. So that's an overview of how we got our data. Now, let me first talk about what's the difference between the era before email came into vogue and now that we're living with email. Now, no one has done a study with the detail that we've done. However, there have been some early studies where people have looked at people's distribution of time over the workday. And so I managed to dig up these studies. And let me just say that these studies from here to the left were done in organizations where email was not used. And Of course, in the mid-90s, email was starting to become adopted by a lot of organizations. These two studies were done in organizations where email was already widespread. This one was done at IBM. This study was done myself with my student, where we looked at 4 different information technology organizations, in other words, high-tech organizations. I'm going to make it easier for you, and I've already averaged these out. And I want you to look at this, and I want you to tell me there's 2 things here that have changed. What are those 2 things? What's changed in the post-email era?
More desk work, less meeting work.
Right. So people spend a larger proportion of their time at desk work, a smaller proportion of their day at scheduled meetings. And when you put this together, I mean, what does this suggest to you? What's your interpretation? What's happening in the workplace? A lot of the work that formerly had been done in formal scheduled meetings is now being done through other means. It's being done at the desktop. A lot of it done through email. But there's also other technologies that have been adopted. So it could also have been desktop conferencing as well. The next thing I want to talk about is how fragmented is work. And so I'm making the claim that people multitask, right? That we're living in a polychronic world. And I hope I can convince you that this is indeed the case. So taking this data, we took this from 35 information workers. It is a huge amount of data because we're looking at behavior down to the second. And this is a categorization of events that we found. These are, averages, the average time that people spend on any event. Now, what are your guesses? What's your best guess of the average amount of time that people spend over the course of the day in all of their actions, not including formal meetings, personal stuff, and just unknown, things that we just could not categorize? We didn't take formal meetings into account, the idea being you're a prisoner when you're at a formal meeting, so there's not too much you can do. What's your estimate of the average amount of time people spend on an event before switching to something else? Any 2 seconds? Minute and a half. Wow, this is a very savvy audience, because usually I get things like 20 minutes. But it's actually 3 minutes and 5 seconds. So people spend, on the average, day in and day out, about 3 minutes on any task or interaction with a person before switching to something else or being interrupted. This is a very robust finding. I had another student that went to a completely different organization, did a very careful study, and came up with a figure of 2 minutes and 59 seconds, no statistical difference. So it's very robust. Now, you might say, well, look, if I'm an academic, I'm in the business of working on papers. And you might say, well, maybe it's not so bad if you keep switching if you're working on the same project. So, I might be working on a paper, and then I have an interaction with someone about that paper, and then I look up something on the web related to the paper, and then I'm typing on the paper. So what's the big deal? Maybe it doesn't matter that I switch every 3 minutes. So we came up with a concept that we call working spheres, a sphere of work. You can think of it like a project. It's very, very similar to a project, but we feel that it's a little bit more expansive in the definition. When people are working on the same goal with a particular constellation of people, there's a deadline involved and a set of resources, which in this case is technology. So what do we find when we look at people's working spheres? We find that people worked in an average of about 12 different working spheres. That's about right for my life. Maybe some of you in the startup world have a lot more working spheres. But they only spend an average of about 10.5 minutes on any working sphere before switching to something else. Now, there's all kinds of interruptions, and we thought that maybe, some interruptions are less significant. For example, if I'm working in my office, someone comes in and says, sign this, and I sign it, and I go right back to work. It's not a disruption for me, right? I can reorient back very quickly. So we played around with the data. We removed interruptions that were 2 minutes or less, with the assumption that anything 2 minutes or less is just not a significant interruption. We still find that every 12 minutes and 18 seconds, people are switching. And let me present this as the flip side. The flip side is that every 12 minutes and 18 seconds, people are experiencing a significant interruption that's 2 minutes or longer. That is what we call a cognitive shift to something else. Now, maybe not all interruptions are the same, and they're not. Interruptions can be caused by yourself. So what does that mean? From the observer's perspective, you're observing someone, and for no apparent reason, they suddenly stop what they're doing, and they check their email, right? Or they pick up a phone, make a phone call. Those are self-interruptions or internal interruptions. External interruptions from an observer's perspective is that you can actually see what that stimulus is that caused the interruption. So it's a phone call or someone coming into the office or cubicle, right? Or the email icon blinking. We find that people self-interrupt a lot. They self-interrupt about 44% of the time, right? And many people who study interruptions look only at external interruptions. But internal interruptions or self-interruptions actually comprise a major part of interruptions. Now, we looked at our data, and we find something that's really interesting. We find that when there's periods of high external interruptions, it's followed by periods of high internal interruptions. And so we find this pattern. When there's low external interruptions, it's followed by patterns of low internal interruptions.
Low and low?
Low, low. So what does this suggest? This suggests to me, and this is the hypothesis that I propose, is that people may be conditioned to self-interrupt. Because when you get into a pattern where you're continually being interrupted, and all of a sudden those external interruptions go away, you're still in this pattern of being interrupted. So we find that people are interrupted from their work and they switch from one task to another. But how long does it take them to resume their interrupted task? So what we did was we looked at the data and we looked at how long it takes them to go back to the task they were interrupted from. We only looked at interruptions done on the same day because we figured it's not fair if we're looking on a Friday and someone has a weekend intervening compared to a Monday when someone has the opportunity the next day to resume the task. We didn't look at interruptions in the last hour of the work because it's also not fair. If someone, if you're leaving in an hour, you don't have that chance to resume the task. So there's good news and there's bad news. And the good news is that 82% of interrupted work was resumed on the same day. That's actually pretty good. But the bad news is that it took an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to resume that interrupted task. So let me put that in perspective, this 23-minute figure. I talked earlier about people spending about 10 and a half minutes in a working sphere. So what this means is that people are working on an average of about 2 intervening working spheres when they're interrupted until they go back and resume their work. So you get interrupted, you work on another working sphere, then you work on another working sphere, and then you go back to the original working sphere. So, we've interviewed all of our informants, and everybody talks about the difficulty in reorienting back to their interrupted tasks. So, software developers, for example, they lose their place. They have to reorient. People report about doing redundant work because you're doing these cognitive shifts and then going back. So let me talk about gender. How many of you think that, using the criteria of resuming work and having fewer self-interruptions, how many of you think men are better at multitasking than women? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you think women are better at multitasking than men? How many of you think there's no difference? Okay. Well, based on that criteria that I mentioned, it turns out that the females in our sample actually were better at multitasking, significantly so. So, first of all, a caveat, we had only 6 females in our sample. However, keep in mind that we had an enormous amount of data for each person. So even though there's only 6 people, we're getting a huge amount of data. So we're taking variability into account here. We find that the females worked in significantly more working spheres. I have central and peripheral up there. That means central is when it's a working sphere that the person is accountable for. Females experienced fewer interruptions overall, and if we dig deeper into that data, we find that those interruptions were actually fewer self-interruptions. So they were less likely to interrupt themselves, which means they were more focused on their tasks. And again, looking at how long it took them to resume work, they were more likely to resume work, significantly more so, than their male counterparts on the same day. We have 87% to about 81%. Let me talk about another study. When we think of multitasking, we usually think of switching between different types of information. But multitasking also occurs with communication. So you can communicate with people in a kind of multitasking mode. People switch between communicating with people and working on solitary work. And you can observe this. And we found that when people communicate with other people, they communicate in terms of what we call chains. You don't just generally have a single communication act. Once you go into communication mode, we call it that, then you tend to communicate with more people. It's almost as if people find it more efficient that when you switch into communication mode, you might as well get all these communications, these interactions out of the way. This is just an example of the first and second link in the chain. These are using Markov probabilities, and we find that if the first link, for example, is face-to-face, the probability that the second link in this chain, or the second communication act, is face-to-face is about 38%. And it's interesting because if you look along the diagonal, you see that when people do these communication chains, they tend to stay within the same communication modality. Perhaps it's just more efficient to communicate that way.
In modality, you mean they don't switch from email to phone?
Right.
They,
Yeah. They do, but with a much lower probability. Right. So now I want to talk about stress. So one of the common themes over all the people that we've studied is how stressful the workplace is. How many of you would say that your work environment or your work experience is stressful? Just a few. How many of you would honestly say it's?
I don't mean that in a bad way.
No, stress can be very invigorating. So we've done laboratory experiments where we've had people come into the laboratory where we induce interruptions. So we had, in this particular case, we gave people an email task, and in one case they just did the task and they had a lot of emails they needed to answer. In the other case, we interrupted them at random intervals, and we did this to simulate what happens in the real world. We find, of course, we subtract the amount of time that it takes to deal with the interruption. We find that when people are interrupted, they, first of all, strangely enough, they work significantly faster when they're interrupted. They also report significantly higher stress, mental workload, frustration, time pressure, and effort. Now, why would people work faster when they are in an interrupted environment? My interpretation is that people realize that time is a finite resource, and you have a limited amount of time to accomplish what you want to do. And if you see that you're working in a pattern of interruptions, you're going to speed up, right, to make sure you accomplish what you need to do by the end of the day. So that's how I interpret it. Let me show you a couple of prototypes that came out of our data. So I worked with Hideto Yuzawa, who visited me from Fuji Xerox. And he was very interested in multitasking, and he said, in Japan, we have these beautiful sand gardens, these Japanese gardens, where people go and they can be very contemplative. At the same time, we were very interested in this idea of designing a tangible interface, because we wanted to experiment to see, what if we can present an off-the-desktop kind of interface that people can use. The theory here is that we want people to be able to control when they can be interrupted by others. We want the user to have control. Now, not all interruptions are bad, and I want to emphasize that. Interruptions can be disruptive, as we found, when they do not concern the task at hand, when they force people to switch topics and think about something completely different. However, if an interruption concerns your task at hand, it can be actually very beneficial, can cause you to think in a very different way about what you're doing. So using these stones, they represented people's different working spheres. The users liked it a lot. They saw it as a toy. They liked to play with it. And using very simple image recognition, we just had them place these rocks in different portions of this little sandbox that signaled to their colleagues, okay, I'm now working on the Kai paper. You can interrupt me on the Kai paper, but nothing else. So the colleagues would see what tasks were available to be interrupted on. Another prototype played around with this idea of the trade-offs between the interruptee and the interrupter, right? It's really a cost benefit for the person who needs that information and wants to interrupt. And for the interruptee, who's not always getting a benefit when they're being interrupted. So we have to think of these design trade-offs. And so we came up with a number of dimensions to make interruptions less intrusive for the interruptee. So the kinds of trade-offs that we balanced were the idea of abstraction. So what's the right amount of abstraction to present the interruption, how to present the information, the delivery mode of the information, the symmetry between interruptee, interrupter, and the degree of obtrusiveness. Okay. Now I want to move into the study that we did recently, which is to really ask the question, how does email affect multitasking? I like to think of the analogy of email as like zombies. Because you know, with zombies, the zombies keep coming and you keep killing them, and they keep coming and you keep killing them. And the email keeps coming and you keep deleting it, and it keeps coming and you keep deleting it. So we decided, can we create an environment where we cut off email from people for a period of time to see how this affects their work life. This study received a lot of press, and this was actually my favorite one. This appeared in The Atlantic, and the headline, "The latest ordinary thing that will probably kill you, email." Since I don't have that much time, I'm just going to go through these very quickly, and I don't really need to talk to you folks about how email is multifunctional. It demands a lot of attention. People do more email communication these days than face-to-face in the office. People respond to email quickly, and people also report a loss of control. So doing this study, as I mentioned, came about because we found people multitask a lot. Emails are a significant source of interruptions, both internal interruptions and external. People spend about a quarter of their time on email, at least for the last study done. This is probably a more current study which showed even more. People can check email up to 36 times an hour. So we wanted to know, we didn't want to just ask hypothetically what happens without email, right? We wanted to actually see. So could we create an environment where people can focus more closely on their tasks? Now, we also wanted to measure how much stress email causes. People have asked people, how stressed are you with email? These are very indirect and very subjective measures, and people tend to overestimate how badly things are. So we wanted to take direct measures of stress. I'll tell you about those in a second. We found a field site that was willing to cooperate to have their email, people in their organization cut off their email. So here's what we did. We first of all used a variety of data collection techniques. I'll talk about that shortly. We first took baseline measures of what people's task switching behavior, their stress, various other kinds of measures. We did that for 3 days. And then we had people spend a period of 5 days, a work week, where they cut off email. We also had colleagues, people who were in the surrounding workplace networks. We had them wear what's called sociometric badges. These are badges that can essentially talk to each other. They can see who's interacting with who face-to-face. We this time used a lot of different data collection techniques. On the top left, how many of you have seen Kitchen Stories? It's a very funny movie. It's a Swedish film. It's a satire on ethnography. We did some human observation. We had sensors in a lot of places. In the back of the chair, because ergonomics research shows when you lean back, you tend to be more relaxed. We had sensors on the desktop to look at shuffling of papers. On the telephones, we could see when people were using the phone. In the doorway, seeing coming in and out of the workplace. We logged people's computer activity on the desktop. And importantly, we had people wear chest strap heart rate monitors so we could detect second-by-second stress levels. It was our direct measure of stress. We had 13 participant groups, 52 people total, 137 hours of ethnographic observation. We logged over 25,000 window changes. We had over 1.6 million sensor events we recorded, over 700 hours of sensor data collection, and over 40,000 heart rate readings. The ethnographic shadowing was important because it enables you to put this data in context. And we found a couple of interesting things here when people were cut off from email. So first of all, they spent more time out of the office. And when we interviewed people, well, yeah, they preferred to talk to people face to face. They could have picked up a phone, or they could have foregone talking with them. They actually enjoyed, walking out of their office and talking to them. Second thing is people engaged more in what's called meta work. Meta work is the coordination of all your work. So it's things like checking calendars and so on. We do have email up here because even though people could not send or receive messages, they could still check file attachments and they could still see what was in their inbox. First, we find that when email is cut off, people spent significantly longer amounts of time on their windows, on their desktop. So that means that they focused longer periods of time, about double the amount of time. Secondly, we found the frequency of switching windows declined, significantly so, about half as much. They went from switching, I think it was roughly about 36 times per hour down to 18. Heart rate, let me just quickly say that it's a little bit counterintuitive when you measure heart rate. You actually, when variability is high, people are actually more relaxed. And when variability is very low, people are in a kind of fight or flight syndrome, and stress is very high. And what did we find? So first of all, let me say that we only got data from 7 people due to technical difficulties. One person, we couldn't pick up a heart rate. She was alive, but she was a runner, and I suspect she just had a really low heart rate. Anyways, despite the fact that we had, could only get data from such few participants, we find nearly a significant difference. Had we had one more person, this would easily have been significant at the conventional 0.05 level. What was the effect on colleagues? So first of all, the only statement that colleagues agreed with was this statement: I was able to get the information I needed to conduct my work today. They agreed with that more in the baseline condition than in the email cutoff. Nothing else affected them. We interviewed people very carefully about their experience, and let me just present some common themes. First of all, about half of our informants felt that they were just completely not in control of their email. They felt a complete lack of agency in their work. Representative quote, "I let the sound of the bell and the pop-ups rule my life." All of the informants reported that when email was cut off, they interacted with people more, right? Both face-to-face and by phone. And they viewed it as a very positive thing. And it made them reflect of how email had hindered workplace relationships for them. Nearly all of the people in our study reported that they could focus more on tasks. And indeed, the data bore that out. The data shows that they did. However, the biggest disadvantage was that people felt cut off. And we probed them. Cut off from what? And they couldn't specify exactly what they were cut off from. Some general idea about the organization. They felt that they were missing out on something important. So what we learned from this email cutoff study was that people could report from actual experience, not just hypothetically, but they can actually say, here's what happened to me. The duration on their task increased. Frequency of task switching decreased without email. Stress went down. Face-to-face communication increased. But because it's really hard to measure productivity among information workers, it's a problem that people in my field, we've been trying to crack this problem for some time. We've just not been able to. So we don't know what the effect on productivity was. So a couple of takeaway messages very quickly. First of all, we may think we know what the user wants, and we may think we know how the user behaves, but it's important to understand how the user really behaves. So you really need to know what the user is actually doing with your systems. Secondly, information technology, because it's used by people, has social norms that are intertwined with its use. For example, with email, there's a social norm. There's this expectation that when you send an email, you're going to get a reply very quickly. You have a different social norm associated with instant messaging, right, and with Facebook. As designers and developers, you need to think about how social norms can be rewired. What are the appropriate social norms that you want to engender in people, in users of this technology? And last, think about designing for continuity of tasks and information. So we're caught in this era, right, where we've got this just huge array of choices. And we're not yet at this point where technology can be used in a way where we can maintain continuity. There's a paradox here. And the paradox is the way IT is currently designed is to support individual tasks. You open up an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document or email, but it's not designed to support how people really work, which is in terms of working spheres. And so IT needs to really support the integration of information into these thematically connected ideas. As it is now, the burden falls on the user to integrate work that's fragmented over time and also over space, because people have information stored all over their computers and mobile devices. So I would like to thank you for your undivided attention. I'd like to thank all the informants that we've looked at, especially to my collaborators. And if you'd like to find out any more of the details, the papers are here on my website. And thank you for listening.